conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the House of Lords has inflicted another defeat on the government's Rwanda bill after voting in favour of an amendment by Labour. Peers are considering the legislation after MPs rejected their changes earlier this week. Ministers are hoping to get the legislation into law before Easter. Public Health Minister Andrea Leadsom says action must be taken to stop illegal boat crossings.
What is so important for the people of this country is that we stop illegal migration. And the fact is, for those illegal migrants, it's also essential for them. They are being human trafficked at great risk of loss of life.
The private hospital where the Princess of Wales underwent surgery says it'll investigate any possible breach of privacy. It follows reports more than one member of staff tried to access Kate's medical records in January. Junior doctors in England have voted in favour of continuing industrial action for a further 6 months. The BMA has called for the government to put forward a new pay offer. And the last series of The Crown is leading the way at the BAFTA Television Awards with 8 nominations. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed down 1 point at 77.37. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.17.
LBC Weather.
With Ripple Energy. Climate action you can be proud of.
Showers across England and Wales, a low of freezing. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Serena Farrow.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, it's 1 minute past 8. Welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question. Let me introduce my panel. Louise Haigh is to my left, Labour Shadow Transport Secretary and MP for Sheffield Heeley. Brendan Clarke-Smith is to her left, Conservative MP for Bassetlaw, who is a minister in the governments of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. And to my right, Zoë Grünewald, political correspondent for The Independent, and next to her, Dan Hodges, columnist for The Mail on Sunday. Your questions are very welcome on 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850. You can WhatsApp us now, also on the same telephone number, and you can send a message via Alexa. Just say send a comment to LBC. And we'd love you to watch us on Global Player as well, because we have 4 beautiful panellists for you to listen to as well as look at.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, first question is from Robbie in Chelmsford. Hi, Robbie.
Good evening, Iain and panel. My question would be, with the general election looming and a fairly stubborn and what seems persistent poll lead of around 20 points for Labour over the Conservative Party, are we in 1992? Is it 1997 again? Or could we even come close to a Canada 1993 type wipeout for the incumbent Tory party? And, as a bonus question, is there anything that the government or the wider Tory party could do about it?
Now, when Robbie talks about Canada 1993, that was when the ruling Conservative Party lost the election and was reduced to a rump of 2 seats. Brendan Clarke-Smith, if that happens, you're out.
Yeah, well, you think so if it's that bad. Don't think we're quite at that stage yet, but I mean, people always try to compare to other elections, and really, I think if British politics has taught us nothing else, it's that we're in very unpredictable territory, and it could be an election that tells its own story completely. So there's a long time to go. They say a week is a long time in politics. We could be many months away from an election. We could have one very soon. I think it's going to go long. I think you're probably looking at November to have one, and I think a lot could change between now and then. You've got the Rwanda's going through at the moment. You know, is that plane going to take off? You've got inflation's coming down.
Let's say a plane does take off. I mean, is that really going to get any extra votes?
I think it's a symbolic thing as much as anything. Now, deterrent, how much is that going to work? You'll see later whether it is. But I think certainly if you think things are going in the right direction, I think there's going to be quite a hoo-ha if that plane does take off at the time. If it doesn't take off, then that raises a lot of other questions there. What's going to be in the manifestos? Is it going to be almost a Brexit Part 2 when we're talking about the ECHR or the HRA and all of these kind of things? I still think there's a lot to play for. I think, if people write us off at your peril, I would say, we do have a pretty good track record, I say, historically. So,
this poll lead, though, as Robbie says, is very, very stubborn. I mean, the budget presumably was meant to make a little indent or a big indent into that, and it failed to do so.
I think the thing is with budgets, I mean, most people don't sit there thinking, I'm going to watch the budget today. People actually look at how their life has improved, and really you don't feel that for a while. People want to feel better, they want to feel more positive, they want to see their pay going further, they want to feel the economy's improving, and that's going to take a bit of time to bed in, I think. So the budget, I mean, generally there's lots of good stuff there. I mean, you're not going to get massive tax cuts when you've spent $400 billion on a pandemic, but all I'd say is that there's still time. There could be another fiscal event that's coming along, and so I still think it's all to play for.
I mean, there was £900 off your tax bill, national insurance. Yep. I mean, that is fairly substantial, but no one seems to have noticed because the Prime Minister and Jeremy Hunt have been a bit rubbish about going out and selling it. That's your problem, isn't it?
I do think we need to sell things better. I mean, the same as during the pandemic. They were helping people with their mortgages, helping save businesses and so on, and just reminding people, I think, of some of the good things that we've done. Or what we've done is a lot of good things that we haven't necessarily communicated well. Free school meals was a great example of that. We did lots of things with the holidays for the first time, and it ended up being a negative news story for us. And we've had this on numerous other occasions where we've done things with water companies, tried to clean that up again. We get lots of negative stories about that as well. So
what does that tell you? How is that going to change over the next few months?
I just think politics works in strange ways. I think if you look at Theresa May in 2017, that was a 20-odd point lead that she had. That disappeared over 4 or 5 weeks. Things narrow, things change very quickly. So all I'd say is, again, don't write us off just yet, Ian.
Something may turn up. That's kind of the argument, then, is it?
It may do. I've obviously got my charm and charisma to fall back on in my own patch.
Your massive personal vote.
Well, so we'll have to see with that. But as I say, people make mistakes as well. We've obviously, Labour, we've challenged over the 28 billion thing. We had this very contentious Gaza vote and everything that went off in Westminster with that. We don't know what's going to happen globally. Things happen, things change.
Right. Louise Haigh.
Well, certainly.
Let's go back to the question. Do you think it reminds you of any of these different elections?
Well, I'm far too young to remember any of those elections. But look, what I would say, and I'm sure you have picked up, is that nobody in the shadow cabinet, in the front bench, in any of Labour's team are complacent about the scale of the challenge that is in front of us at the next general election.
Using words like if we're privileged
enough to form the next Labour government, exactly. And it's right, all sorts of things can happen in that time, and the swing that we would need to achieve is the same as 1997 in order to form a majority of one. So we have never achieved in the history of our party the kind of election victory that we will need to at this general election. But I do think that consistent poll lead is reflective of a genuine desire for change in the country and a complete rejection of 14 years of failure that has left people with real incomes that are barely higher than they were when we left office, with not a single public service working effectively, with the economy nowhere near as big as it should be. And I'm sorry, but the issues that Brendan just raised, Rwanda and potentially making the next general election around the ECHR or the Human Rights Act, demonstrate that they are not in touch with the real issues that the vast majority of people in this country are struggling with.
Let me just ask you a question on that, because before we came on air, you were saying that you were out in Ashfield knocking on doors at the weekend. Did a single person mention the word Rwanda to you?
No. In fact, I tell a lie. One person did raise it, and they said it was, just a waste of time. And he was a 2019 Conservative voter, and we had a long conversation. To be fair, he didn't know where he was voting now, but he certainly wasn't going to vote Conservative. What was interesting, though, was that not a single voter in Ashfield raised Lee Anderson, so he's not quite the celebrity he perhaps thinks he is.
So is he now independent? Does he call himself independent, Brendan?
He's reform, isn't he?
What am I talking about?
A week is such a long time.
Well, it really is, isn't it? So you say you're too young to remember 1992 or 1997. Obviously, I believe you.
It was 10 in 1997.
But do you think there are dangers of a large majority? I mean, I always remember, again, you won't remember this, in 1983, Francis Pym, who had been Margaret Thatcher's Foreign Secretary, went on Question Time and basically said, no, we don't want a big majority. They're not good things. And of course, she saw that, and he was sacked from the cabinet after the election.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Well, look, I've only ever been an MP in opposition, and not only am I not old enough to remember those elections, I've never voted for Labour in a winning general election. So the first time I voted was 2010. So, I am not going to be turning my nose up at any majority of any description. One will be sufficient, but a large majority would obviously be brilliant. What I am worried about is, the fact that we have been polling consistently high. I am worried about a sense of complacency in the electorate and the feeling that, well, we're definitely going to win.
And among party workers, I guess, because if people think it's all in the bag, they're not going to deliver that extra street that they would have done had it been on a knife edge, are they?
Perhaps, although that is certainly not what I've been picking up. Our activists are super hungry after 14 years in opposition, and they know what's at stake in this general election.
Dan Hodges. You are old enough to remember 1992.
I am old enough, and to answer the question, I think we are now somewhere between 97 and Canada-style wipeout. I mean, I think that's what we're looking at. And there was something just like a week and a half ago that struck me about Rishi Sunak, which is he strikes me now as he's starting to resemble, a sort of Sacha. I've got Sacha stuck in my mind. What's his name? Sacha Baron Cohen. Yeah, Sacha. Thank you. Sacha Baron Cohen character.
I'm wondering where you're going.
I know. Yeah.
Sacha Baron Cohen character. In that we had that whole panoply of. So you know how Sacha Baron Cohen he cosplays being world leaders and we had this whole thing of Rishi Sunak, and it was like there was the podium outside of Downing Street, and broadcasters and journalists were told, get ready for there's a major announcement outside of Downing Street. And it was Rishi Sunak addressing the fact that George Galloway had just won a by-election. And we had it again this week. We had it yesterday with, it was on social media, and Downing Street were pushing it hard. It was a big thing, and it was like Rishi Sunak, big thing. And it was like the football task force. And this is where we are now. This is where we are with, as you said, we had the budget, which was billed to us as one of the game-changing moments. I can't remember a budget that died in news terms and political terms within 24 hours, and that's what happened. And the idea that we have got this now till October or November or, God forbid, even January, that this is what we as a country and we as a government are looking forward to. I mean, God bless, Brendan's going to have to be here month after month after month, just putting up these lines, trying to sort of pretend that black is white.
Well, he almost had me convinced.
Well, I'm glad, Ian, because he didn't have me convinced. I'm not entirely sure he had himself convinced. Come on, look, I am old enough. We're all old enough. We know how this ends. So the only question now is, do we put the country through 6, 7, 8 months before we end it? Or do we say, right, whatever the Conservative Party wants to do or did or whatever, it's not actually about Rishi Sunak or anybody else. Governments have sell-by dates. Governments have sell-by dates. We saw it in 97. We saw it in 2010. I mean, I can't remember a government that is so obviously more past its sell-by date now. We have to end this now. We can't carry on like this. This idea that Rishi Sunak is clinging to something might turn up is the charitable explanation. A lot of other people I'm speaking to, Tories as well, Labour, is just saying Rishi Sunak's just hanging on now because he just likes being Prime Minister, because he just likes it. I'm not by no means giving Labour a free pass. I think there are a lot of questions about what Labour would offer, what Labour would do in government. But we have to end this now. We can't carry on with zombie government for another 6, 7 or 8 months, just in the interest of the country.
Zoe?
Well, Brendan obviously has to spin it positively because that's his job, and Lou obviously has to spin it in a cautious way because that's her job as well. I agree.
What's your job?
My job is to think about things and give a measured perspective. I think essentially it does look like the polls aren't shifting, and I'm sorry to say, Brendan, but I think the Conservative Party have fundamentally damaged their trust with the electorate. I don't think they've worked hard enough to bring it back, and I think at this point, once you had Partygate and you had the disastrous mini budget, and then you've had all the self-indulgent Tory infighting that's gone on after that, people are just not going to forgive a party that also fundamentally hasn't turned around their economic fortunes in the last 14 years. Now, I do think the poll lead is fairly firm. Something that could make it narrow is what Labour brings out at a general election. Currently, the bits of policy Labour have presented have either been stolen by the Conservatives or they haven't really been hashed out very much. And there is some suggestion that people aren't entirely convinced by Starmer. Maybe there's not a great deal of enthusiasm for him. So that's the challenge for Labour. But I think either way, whether the majority is big, whether it's slightly smaller, whether it shrinks, whether people don't turn out at all, we are going to see the Conservatives lose quite disastrously, because I don't see how at this point in time they can bring back all those voters they've lost because they haven't been honest with them.
Well, Brendan, I'm going to give you a final word on this because the three of them have ganged up on you a bit.
Again, things can change, and things can change quite significantly. I mean, what I would say is, people will get towards that election if they see the economy starting to improve, if they see that the numbers are coming down with illegal migration. And when I knock on the doors now, people don't talk about Rwanda necessarily, but they will talk about the wider issue, and it's that fairness that's built into it as well. And I think Brexit was about more than just leaving the European Union in that sense, and we still get that now. Whether it's policing crowds in London, again, that's about taking back control as well. So I think if they see some improvement there and it's going into the election and they say, well, you've got this or you've got the unknown, we're on the right track. I think that's an incredibly powerful thing.
So it's a stick with nerves for fear of worse election rather than a hopey changey one.
Well, you remember 1992, and without comparing too much to other elections, everybody thought Neil Kinnock was going to win that, and there was the big rally and everything. And then, as you said, people got complacent. And yeah, I'm a bit older as well, I suppose. I think things do actually focus minds, I would say. So I'd say we're not out of it yet. There's plenty of stuff still to come, and I would say, politics is a strange game at times.
Lots of other subjects to talk about. We'll come to one of them in just a moment. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
Now, it's Get at Brendan Clarke-Smith Day today on the WhatsApp messages. Stuart says, can you ask Brendan when he'll be scuttling off to reform like his 30p mate?
Oh. Well, I've been a Conservative Party member since 1998. So, yeah, I think they're going to have to bury me with my membership card, I think, Ian. So
have you been approached? Have they tried to tickle you up?
No, and this is the strange thing about it. So I had all these rumours going round, mainly because Lee's a good mate of mine. You know, we go out for a pint and so on. So I just thought I'd have a bit of fun last week, and I just put a graphic saying statement and a link on there, and I sort of rickrolled them, had their Rick Astley music video on it, so I caught a few journalists out with that one. But yeah, I'm going nowhere. I'm perfectly happy where I am. And
has Lee made a mistake?
I'm really disappointed that he's gone. I know he felt that he had nowhere else to go with it, and he was kind of almost pushed into this position. I'd still like him to come back at some point if that's possible. Did we make a mistake suspending him?
He's ratted twice now. You think he'd be accepted if he re-ratted?
Well, I think he's still got the same views as he's had before. I think he's pretty consistent as Lee. But yeah, I thought it was a shame that he lost the whip. I think he's a big loss. I think he's very well liked. He's good constituency MP and so on. But I think it would have been better sticking with the Conservatives.
Well, we do have three other members of the panel as well. Louise Haigh is here, Labour Shadow Transport Secretary, Dan Hodges from the Mail on Sunday, and Zoë Grünewald from the Independent. We've got a very controversial question coming up from Annie in Carnforth. Annie, good evening. What would you like to ask?
Good evening, Ian and panel. Well, the Canadian government have announced today that they're banning the sale of arms to Israel, and have criticised the Israeli government for the way in which they're conducting the war in Gaza. And as babies are dying of starvation already, and more than 2 million people are at imminent danger of being starved to death, does the panel think that the British government should ban the sale of arms to Israel and call for an immediate ceasefire?
Right, let's give a little bit of background to this. The Canadian government has vowed not to export any more arms to Israel for the rest of this year at least, after a non-binding vote by its parliament yesterday. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has made clear he supports Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas, but has been increasingly critical of the IDF's actions in Gaza. Meanwhile, our Deputy Prime Minister, Oliver Dowden, has called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza in order to get aid into the territory. Louise?
Well, look, I don't think anybody expected the war in Gaza to still be ongoing at the scale and the death toll still to be mounting at the speed and size at which it's doing today. More than 30,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza, and now there is talk about an offensive in Rafah, which would be utterly catastrophic. And he's absolutely right. There are hundreds of thousands of people starving, and that's why Labour called for an immediate ceasefire in the parliamentary vote last month, and why we've been saying that under no circumstances should any kind of offensive happen in Rafah. With relation to arms sales, the export licences are very clear that they should not be exported if there is any risk of a breach of international law, and the Israeli government is now the subject of investigation under the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, and so the government will have to assess and address whether those exports and the licences by which they've been guaranteed are being used to commit international crimes in Gaza.
And do you think that Labour's policy on this needs to be tweaked?
Well, I think the existing legislation and the existing licences are sufficient because they are clear that the exports of arms should not be used if there's a risk of breach. I think we need to have an answer from government very quickly about the legal advice it's received and how that should be applied to the licences. But as I say, clearly, if an offensive happens in Rafah, there will have to be progress then.
Dan Hodges.
No. Under no circumstances should there be any ceasefire until, at a minimum, the hostages are released. Because what are we talking about by a ceasefire? We're talking about precluding Israel from conducting any military operations in Gaza. I can't believe any government would seriously suggest that should be the case whilst its own citizens are being held hostage. this conflict happened solely because Hamas launched a barbaric attack on Israel, which involved the death of thousands of Israeli civilians, the torture, the murder, the rape of thousands of Israeli civilians. If that had happened in this country, with the greatest respect to Louise, I sincerely hope Louise would not be adopting the stance she's adopting at the moment. I can't believe that Louise would be adopting the stance at the moment if it was British citizens that were being held hostage. I sincerely hope that under Keir Starmer, a Labour government would not rule out military action to help secure the release of British hostages under any circumstances. And as I say, it's a very fashionable.
But the question was about arms sales.
Yeah, but you can't conduct military operations if you don't have the weapons to conduct those military operations. We constantly have people showing us images saying, "Look, isn't this terrible? The Israeli government are conducting these indiscriminate attacks on Palestinians," and then we say, "But we shouldn't provide them with the precision munitions which enable them to actually target in a more accurate way the Hamas terrorists and Hamas murderers who perpetuate these atrocities." So, no, absolutely not. Under no circumstances should we prevent Israel in any way from defending itself from the sort of attack we saw from Hamas.
It's quite clear, though, that the British government, its position has slightly changed since October the 7th. The language that particularly David Cameron is talking is, shall we say, a little bit more sceptical about Israel's actions now. So therefore, it's a reasonable question to ask.
It has, and you're absolutely right, and the British government's position should not have shifted.
OK. Zoe?
I don't think the UK should be supplying arms to Israel. The images that are coming out of Palestine, out of Gaza, are just horrific. We know that this is a particularly young population, particularly vulnerable. People are starving to death. There's no access to water, hospitals, supplies that are necessary. I mean, this is becoming a bombardment. And I think it's vitally important that if a state is under investigation for potentially being in conflict with international law, then of course the states, while it's under investigation, should stop supplying it with arms, because the damage that can be done if it is found that they have done is extraordinary. And I think...
But isn't that finding them guilty before the judgment?
Well, it's just not supplying them with arms. I mean, they have weapons. They have a huge military. It's just making sure that no excess damage is done. If they are found to be in contravention of international law, then it would be extraordinary that we had supplied them with arms to do so. So I think at this stage we need to have a serious conversation. We also need to be talking about diplomatic solutions. Now that can, I'm sure Dan will think that is miles away from where we are now. But I think if we keep just providing arms and we're not talking about what a long-term solution to this conflict looks like, if we're not trying to open up lines of communication on both sides, if we're not putting pressure as Western nations on Israel to do the right thing, then this is just going to carry on. And we need... Can I
just respond to that? We have diplomatic communication going on. There are talks going on between Israel and Hamas that are being brokered. We are not a million miles away from a solution to this. We are within very easy reach of a solution to this, which is Hamas releases the hostages that it's kidnapped. The second Hamas does that, Israel will stop the bombardment. It will stop the attacks. This entire thing has been perpetuated by Hamas. None of us were talking about this issue on the day before Hamas stormed across the border with its commando units, murdered, raped, kidnapped, tortured thousands of Israelis. If someone had stormed across our borders and had raped, tortured, murdered and kidnapped thousands of our citizens, would you be sitting here saying you know what, we've got to talk to them.
I think everybody...
No, I'm sorry, answer genuinely, would you?
Well, when it happened on October the 7th, most people were in agreement that Israel had a right to defend itself, of course.
Yeah, but now exactly.
But you're months on, you're not getting to a solution.
You were saying Israel had a right to defend itself. You're now sitting here a few months later, because it's not fashionable anymore.
Well, no.
Saying literally saying we should deny Israel the capacity to defend itself, because we should not
to look at the images of children starving.
It's not
and bloody
about the images, Zoe. This isn't about
no, it's about the real life
Dan,
lost.
let Zoe finish.
It's about the real life lost. And when you're seeing just such a vulnerable population being decimated, and you're wondering if what you've got to think long term, what is going to be left if you decimate Gaza, if you create so much trauma, so much violence, so much loss. What do you think is going to come out at the end when the conflict is over?
Were the people who were raped, murdered, tortured and kidnapped, were they not a vulnerable population as well?
Of course. I mean, nobody's saying that what happened on October the 7th was in any way acceptable. It was absolutely horrific. But you need to think about what's going to happen long term, and you need to prioritise diplomacy.
Brendan.
I mean, I agree with Dan, I'll be honest. I think it's one of those things where you look at who the real enemy of the Palestinian people is, and I would say the real enemy is actually Hamas here. Hamas have caused this. Hamas have caused this problem. There's extreme provocation there, and yes, Israel do have a right to defend themselves. Yes, it does need to be proportionate, and obviously there do need to be limits on that. But then I think what they would also say, again, those hostages have not been released. I think some of the cases that are going on, I think a resolution the South Africans are pushing and so on, I think are highly questionable. I'd say some of the news that's coming out there, we've seen all sorts of fake news being pushed there to create the Israelis as the bad guys, and I think it's been deliberately caused to unsettle the region. I think you've probably got hostile actors like Iran who've been pushing their agenda in the region for a very long time there, and so from the perspective of arms sales, again, people have a right to defend themselves. And I think the laws that we have in place and the checks and balances that we have in place are sufficient at the moment. And yes, we do want to have these humanitarian pauses, and we do want to make sure that people get supplies, and one death is far too many. So what we're seeing at the moment, yes, of course that's too many, but there's a pathway through that. I would like to see Hamas surrender, but first of all, I would like to see those hostages released. I would like to see some form of ceasefire, but you are not going to get a ceasefire unless you get both sides to agree it. And at the moment, it's the Israelis who are put under all the pressure. And I think people have forgot it's Hamas that caused this in the first place, Iain.
I think the other issue is that even if all the hostages were released, does anyone seriously think that Israel would just say, OK, then we're going to stop here?
I'm sorry, but firstly, Israel has specifically said, and I believe Israel on this, that if the hostages were released, there would be a pause. But secondly, I'm sorry, even Brendan was saying we need a humanitarian pause. If there were hundreds of British hostages,
okay, you have made that. You've made this point several times, Dan.
Would anyone say we cannot conduct military operations to rescue them? No one would say that, surely.
A spirited discussion, and we'll have another one on the next subject in just a few minutes' time. It's 8:33. News headlines on LBC with Serena Farrow.
Peers have backed more amendments to the government's Rwanda bill, delaying the legislation from being passed until after Easter. The Lords is reconsidering the law, which is an attempt to end small boat crossings. Officials at the private hospital where the Princess of Wales had surgery have suggested they'll investigate claims of a breach of privacy. The report staff at the London clinic tried to access Kate's private medical records without permission. The data watchdog is also looking into it. And the NHS in England is facing more disruption, with junior doctors voting to extend their industrial action until September. The government says it's disappointed. LBC weather wet across England and Wales tonight, but the showers will die out. Rain and gales moving in from the northwest as well later on, with temperatures down to freezing.
This is LBC.
My friend Richard has just texted me, who's on Cross Question tonight? I've only just tuned in. Well, let me tell you, Louise Haigh, Labour Shadow Transport Secretary, Conservative MP for Bassetlaw, Brendan Clarke-Smith, Dan Hodges from the Mail on Sunday, and Zoë Grünewald from The Independent. Right, a text question here from Martin in Wolverhampton. The boss of P&O Ferries admitted the company broke the law when it sacked 800 of its workers 2 years ago. And now The Guardian claims it's paying staff less than £5 an hour. Why aren't the UK authorities doing anything about this? Now, just by way of background to this, today the French government has immediately introduced a new minimum wage law for ferry workers in response to these reports, which works out at £9.96 per hour. Paris Maritime Minister claims that the demands being put on staff, which also reportedly includes working 7 days a week by the ferry operator, are dangerous. Well, I can remember when this was a massive story, and I think there were a lot of Conservatives who thought that P&O were acting disgracefully and promised to do something about it, and yet it seems to me that nothing has been done. Shadow Transport Secretary, what would you do differently?
Well, it is an absolute scandal. As I say, it's just gone the 2-year anniversary, and the CEO of P&O Ferries came to Parliament and confirmed that they had illegally sacked 786 British workers, and now we know, thanks to this investigation by ITV and The Guardian, that their workers are working 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, sometimes for 3 months at a time. And some of the workers spoke to the investigation about not seeing daylight for 3 months at a time because they're working below deck. So, these are conditions that are pretty close to slavery, frankly. And it's even more scandalous because Peter Hebblethwaite again told Parliament that the lowest possible wage would be £5.15 an hour, and now we know they're getting paid less. So nothing the government has done in the interim period has affected it. In fact, P&O Ferries is now doing very well commercially out of this model. We've said we'll ban fire and rehire, and we would put the Seafarers Charter, which the government has introduced but is on an entirely voluntary footing, would put that on a statutory basis in order to tackle these wages and conditions issues at sea, because at the moment it's basically a free-for-all, and you've got companies that are headquartered here that are treating their workers in this horrendous way and making a lot of money out of it.
If they're headquartered here, surely they have to pay minimum wage like any other company.
Well, the difficulty in the law as it stands is because it's on international waters. This investigation was on the Dover-Calais route, and once they're out of UK waters, it is difficult to apply the minimum wage, but that's why we've said we'll put the Seafarers Charter on a statutory basis.
And this will be in your manifesto.
It will, and we've also committed to banning fire and rehire, which would have stopped them doing it in the first place. But it's quite clear that P&O Ferries aren't even abiding by the law as it stands, because they're not paying the minimum wage whilst they're in UK waters either.
Should they be banned from having any government contracts?
100%, yeah. And we know that the government has continued to award them taxpayers' money. We've found out just this week that they've awarded them nearly £1 million this year. So not only are they still profiting, they're still profiting from the taxpayer.
I feel as if I've achieved something here, because whenever I have a Labour spokesperson on, you say, well, will that be in the manifesto? Oh, we can't commit to that yet.
No.
So well done you is what I'm trying to say. Zoe?
I think it's absolutely appalling and unfortunately all too common. I think there's some Labour have plans to bring in a load of reforms for workers, and I feel quite optimistic about those, because I think in this country we have a productivity problem, we have a well-being problem, and a lot of those things can be tackled. It's not a silver bullet, but a lot of them can be tackled by improving workers' rights, giving people stability and peace of mind that their boss isn't going to turn around and fire them, isn't going to pay them less than minimum wage. And I think up until now the balance has been slightly off. I think the balance has been tipped in favour of business. I think if you want to have a happier group of workers who work harder, work better and feel more empowered at work, then you need to start with workers' rights. This is a prime example of what can happen when the government isn't keeping its eye on this, and how it can affect really hardworking people. And then it all comes out as this huge scandal when it's too late. So it's really good to hear that Labour are thinking of doing something. I just think this could be part of the root of our productivity problem here in the UK. If you make people proud to go to work, if you make people feel safe and secure, people work harder.
Brendan, why has nothing been done since the scandal first emerged 2 years ago? Because Grant Shapps, when he was Transport Secretary, I mean, he seemed genuinely outraged by it, and yet nothing seems to have happened.
Well, as has already been mentioned, the law is already there, and if you are paying somebody less than minimum wage, if you're not applying, if you're not abiding by the laws that we already have, then there is scope to actually do something about that. If you are in international waters, then other things apply, and it is incredibly difficult to apply domestic laws to those kind of situations, and that's wherever you are in the world. So,
they're a British company. It's very easy to apply the law to a British company.
Yeah, and you can put pressure on them. Certainly, I'm not very happy at the untruths that were told at the time. You know, we've hauled these people in, and as I said, I think that was reprehensible at the time. I think there's pretty much cross-party agreement on that issue. And you want to shame them into that, and you want to pay your workers properly, and you want to do this. I would say that I would have questions, though, about all these extra workers' rights. I know the unions are very keen on this, but when it actually comes to the crunch, you know, these things do cost money, and there'll be a lot of pressure on Labour, and when they're looking at their plans, and they're looking at the OBR and everything else, and what they can do, and the existing legislation, they will realise it's a lot more difficult than it actually seems.
P&O Ferries are making good profits. They have government contracts. I think is entirely reasonable for you as a Conservative MP to think, well, they're a British company, they're making a profit, and yet they're paying their staff £5 an hour. That is reprehensible.
Yeah, I agree. So I would actually go as far as actually saying that to them, that if you don't clean your act up, then we will look at that and we will consider not giving you those contracts.
They've had 2 years to, clean their act up, and they're doing worse than they did 2 years ago, and the government's still rewarding them for it.
Yeah, I mean, some of those will be ongoing contracts as well. So, I mean, it's very difficult to break an existing contract you've got if they're not in breach of it. So I think there's also that point as well. But certainly in future, if you're awarding contracts, I would actually look at there's a reputational issue there as well, and we want to actually say that when we are giving people government contracts, we put a new procurement bill through as well that actually should help with this kind of thing. But again, it comes down to your corporate your corporate well-being. If you're a P&O, you want to be able to project to people that you treat your workers well. You do not want your company to be
clearly
with that. If they're not going to do that, it's going to damage their reputation.
Yeah, I mean, if let's just say, for example, the workers, the workers in question had been paid their full wage, and the workers in question had decided not to pay their tax on that full wage, they would not be. The response of the government would not be to shame them in a reputational way. Ultimately, the response of the government would be to send them to jail if they didn't pay their tax. Why are we not sending the directors of this company to jail for this sort of stuff? I'm being very, very serious about this. That everybody listening to this programme has to pay tax at penalty, ultimately, of incarceration. Why are the directors of this company allowed to get away? Because, as Louise said, and this is not contested, they are breaking UK law. These are laws which have been passed by Conservative and British government and Labour governments. They're breaking the law. Why the people and the directors of this company are making huge personal profits out of denying some people on the lowest incomes? Why are these people not in jail? I'm asking a genuine question. Why are we not jailing them for this?
Well, it is a good question.
If they're breaking the law, absolutely. I agree.
But they have broken the law.
Is it illegal or is it immoral?
It's illegal.
If they're breaking the law, but then the law already exists.
So if the law exists, so why are we talking about reputational shame and maybe potentially withdrawing? Why are the people who are running these companies not going to jail?
We'll leave that one hanging there. Thank you very much indeed. It's 8:47.
This is LBC.
8:51, Louise, Haigh, Brendan Clarke-Smith, Dan Hodges and Zoë Grünewald with us to answer your questions. Here's a text question from Jennifer. 6 more months of junior doctors' strikes loom. What will it take to get them back into theatre for good? Now, junior doctors who are members of the British Medical Association have voted to continue their strikes over pay and conditions for another 6 months, with some 98% of those voting to support more walkouts. 98%. I have to say I'm slightly surprised at that. Zoe, let's start with you.
Well, I think junior doctors, obviously, they want, I think it's a 35% pay rise, which obviously the government ministers are saying ain't going to happen. It's far more than nurses, far more than most people have got in the face of inflation and the cost of living over the past few years. But I do think there is something to be said for the plight of junior doctors. I mean, at the minute, the NHS is absolutely on its knees. There's major staff shortages. There's also major staff shortages in the social care sector, which has a knock-on effect on the NHS. There's issues with the technology. There's crumbling buildings. I mean, who would want to be a junior doctor? And I think that's very much the feeling that not only have they not had pay that's kept up with inflation, has not kept up with increasing costs, but they are under more stress, they are more tired, they are more under-resourced, they are more understaffed. And there is seemingly no recognition from the government about this. 6 more months, I mean, that's going to really worry everybody, including government ministers. We've already seen that waiting lists keep going up. That's one of Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges, so I'm sure he's feeling particularly nervous about that. But I can't see an end in sight to this, because until you fix the problems with the NHS, which take way more than pay rises and injection of cash, you're not going to see major changes to the health service. So I think this is a war of attrition that's just going to go on and on until somebody comes in and does something revolutionary with the NHS, which is some combination of money and reform.
And is his name worth streeting, Louise Haigh?
Oh, absolutely.
but the problem here is, as Zoe says, if you're going to dramatically reform the health service, it will need a lot of extra money. And Rachel Reeves isn't going to give him any extra money to do it, is she?
Well, we obviously did have our non-dom tax commitment, which the Tories nicked. Yeah, exactly, a couple of weeks ago. So, but we are absolutely committed to the pledges that we've made to bring down NHS waiting lists. And Rachel and the rest of the Shadow Treasury team are finding where that money can be drawn from now. But look, I mean, this is a total disaster. This is, the second year of the national strike in the NHS. It's cost more than 1 million appointments. And cost the NHS more than £2 billion. And it is a massive, massive failure of this Conservative government and of Rishi Sunak for failing to take personal responsibility on it. It's past time that he took responsibility and got round the negotiating table with the junior doctors' unions and found a resolution. Pay is clearly a massive issue in this dispute, but so is the fact, as Zoe said, that they're totally burned out and overworked, so they need to get round and negotiate on the wider issues as well. And I think it's really important to note, we didn't have a national strike in the NHS in 13 years of Labour government. This is a direct failure of the Conservatives.
Brendan, 98% of junior doctors have supported these workouts. Now, after more than a year of strikes, you would have expected that number to have been lower. I would have thought. They seem absolutely resolute in taking this dispute on.
Well, they're the ones who voted, and they're not all members of the BMA, of course, but I think also with a 35% rise, and MPs have just had a 5% rise, I don't think many people are going to feel sympathy for MPs, but if you look at other professions as well, they're not getting anywhere near 35%, so that suggests to me that either you're asking for way too much, or perhaps the union, if you have been so underpaid, perhaps the union hasn't been doing its job properly.
They have said they're not expecting it in one go. It would be over a period of time, which I think has been sort of slightly different to what they said at the beginning of this dispute.
Yeah, I mean, if you're overworked, I came from the teaching profession, most teachers will say to you, it's not necessarily about the pay, it's about the amount of marking you do, it's about the amount of hours you do and taking the pressure off. Now, you're only going to do that by actually recruiting more people, you're going to deal with workload issues. So I think there was a trade-off there. So we do have the long-term NHS plan. We are looking at ways of taking that workload off. With GPs, again, they have an argument at the moment about things like physician associations that they're unhappy with, or we've tried to use pharmacists to try and cut down on things as well. So there is a wider issue about reform there with the NHS, but the NHS is under a huge amount of pressure. We had a big waiting list coming from COVID. More people are using the NHS for more things than they've ever done before. And it does creak under that pressure when you've got so many people putting so many demands on it. So I completely get why they want a pay rise, and it's difficult, but at the same time, they've got to be reasonable.
Dan?
Well, to answer the question, what will end it, Lou kind of let the cat out of the bag there. It will be, there's a Labour government. This is a political strike. West Streeting will not be able to offer huge amounts of money to the junior doctors. Rachel Reeves won't offer new money to the junior doctors. But when we get a Labour government, the strikes will end, because, as I said, it's.
Or even if they don't get any extra money.
Yeah, of course. What are they going to do? They're going to sit there on strike for another 5 years, 10 years while Labour sits there. That they will end it then. And
because this left-wing clique has taken over the BMA, is that what you're saying?
Everybody knows that, and that's what will happen. And the reality is, these are junior doctors. What they did, they didn't. They were junior doctors.
But if that were the case,
can I just say,
98% of them voted to continue the strikes. How can you describe that as political?
Ian, they're junior doctors. What did they think when they were joining the profession? They thought they were joining the profession because they were going to get a 35% pay rise. They thought they were going to get really easy hours. They thought they were going to get really easier working conditions. Come on.
They might have expected their pay to keep in line with inflation.
They're asking for 35%.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying I'm not saying that we would commit to that, but their pay has not kept in line with inflation for the last 14 years, and I think that would be a reasonable thing to expect.
So you're going to give them that commitment today?
I'm not making any commitment today.
Well, exactly. If you're not going to give them the commitment, why should exactly? So you're not going to give them commitment, so no one's going to give that commitment. So why were they expecting it?
Why would I think it is a reasonable thing to expect for your pay to keep in line with inflation in any role.
So if it's reasonable, why won't you commit to it?
I'm just because it's not my job to commit to it today. I can't. I'm not coming into the negotiations.
There are many other groups of workers that haven't kept up with inflation as well.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is vote Labour for unreasonable pay increases?
No, of course not. But I'm just saying,
which is it? Are you going to give them the reasonable pay increase, or you're not?
The junior doctor strike is not just about pay, as I said earlier. It is about them being absolutely over.
You said it was reasonable.
I think it's reasonable for any worker to expect pay in line with inflation. Absolutely. Would you expect your pay to rise in line with inflation? Would you hope that it would?
Well, no. My pay sadly doesn't always rise in line with inflation, and when it doesn't, I don't.
You're well
stop
paid
writing my ups.
Right, we've got to get to our fun question, which is from Donovan in the Highlands. I'd love to be called Donovan Dale. Don't you think that would sound great? A convenience store on one of the Orkneys screwed up its Easter egg order and accidentally ordered more chocolate eggs, 720, than there are people on the island, around 500. Which food order would you be quite pleased to get as badly wrong as this, leaving you with loads of it? Zoe?
Just packets and packets of mini eggs, because they're the best chocolate ever. In fact, the most romantic thing anyone ever did for me was send me a big box of like a huge box of mini eggs.
I thought you needed feeding up.
Maybe not anymore, but yeah.
Oh, okay. That didn't work then.
Yeah, it didn't work.
Dan.
Yeah, it was a weird one. I was thinking about this, and I was. Do you know the one thing I would really, really love? I used to love. The Duchy of Lancaster spinach soups, which you used to be able to get.
How middle class can you get?
Exactly. I do unashamedly middle class, and you can't get them anymore. And I know, Prince, King Charles. I don't know if you're listening, but
actually, funny enough,
I know you've got a lot on.
We know that the Queen does listen to LBC,
but could you just try and see about getting them back into stock or whatever? That would be me.
Okay. Brendan?
I like Haribo Star Mix. I mean, I always sort of eat those, but I mean, I think I'm a bit worried about what it will do to my teeth, and I don't want to get in a debate about dentistry tonight.
That's not.
I think.
Louise?
I'm a crisp addict. I think it'd be the chili Heatwave Doritos.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I could go for that. Right, thank you all very much indeed. Now, on Monday's panel, we have the Conservative Party Deputy Chair, no, not that one, Rachel McLean, former Corbyn advisor James Schneider, and the Labour Shadow Minister Nick Thomas Simmons. Now, coming up in the next hour, we are going to talk... What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about smoking, because powers to issue £100 on-the-spot fines are to be handed to council officers enforcing a new landmark law banning future generations from smoking. Now, the government have copied this from Jacinda Ardern's New Zealand government, who essentially want to phase out smoking. And yet the New Zealand government have decided that this is a really bad idea and they've abandoned the law, but Britain is going ahead with it. First of all, do you agree with that law that I think they're starting with 14-year-olds, and that sort of every year that it'll change, so a new generation effectively won't be able to buy cigarettes? Is that the way forward?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the government's plans to send some asylum seekers to Rwanda are facing another setback. The House of Lords has voted to make 7 changes to the draft legislation. Peers put forward the amendments after they'd had 10 thrown out by MPs on Monday. Conservative former Vice Chair Raymond Christie says removing migrants from the country is the only way to stop smugglers.
We put the Navy in there, but that didn't work. We had a joint coordination centre with France. That didn't quite work. We've got the return scheme with Albania. That has worked, with 93% of individuals being sent back to Albania.
A man has reportedly been stabbed after crossing the channel in a small boat. Kent police were called to Dover Western Docks at lunchtime and he was taken to hospital. The Home Office says it was an isolated incident. The hospital which treated the Princess of Wales says all steps will be taken to deal with an alleged data breach. It's after reports at least one member of staff at the London clinic tried to access Kate's medical notes. She spent 13 nights there in January having abdominal surgery. The UK's privacy watchdog is now investigating the claims, and lawyer James Moss told LBC about the next steps.
They would be gathering information, as much information as possible, and pulling together evidence to assess whether there was a case that could be taken further and should be taken further.
Detectives say an IT worker who murdered a couple with the opioid fentanyl would have killed again if he'd not been caught. Luke DeWitt from West Mersey in Essex befriended Stephen and Carol Baxter and created fake personas to manipulate them and change their will. One was of a solicitor. Police have released a test recording he made to try to dupe them.
Hi Carol, it's Jenny. Hi Carol, it's Jenny. It's Cheryl's sister. Yes, oh, it's so nice to finally speak to you after all these messages we've been doing.
And junior doctors in England have backed another 6 months of strikes, but the government's told the BMA the payoff on the table is a fair one. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed down 1 point at 77.37. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.17.
LBC Weather.
With Ripple Energy, part-owner wind farm for a greener way to power your home.
Rain across England and Wales, low of freezing. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Serena Farrow.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Four minutes past 9 on LBC. Welcome to the programme. If you've just joined us, it's Iain Dale here with you until 10. I've never been a smoker. That is not a confession. It's not also something that I'm necessarily particularly proud of. I've just never understood the appeal of cigarettes, or I've never understood the appeal of e-cigarettes and vaping. Just leaves me completely cold. I remember when I lived in Germany, when I was 18, virtually every German teenager smoked. And I thought, well, there must be something in it. So I went down to the local tobacconist and bought a packet of Camel cigarettes and smoked them one after the other. And at the end of it, I thought, why do people do this? It's horrible. So I've never really smoked, and I don't understand why people do. I understand it's addictive,